Chapter 3, The Food Supply, Screencast 2. Now, I may not have said this earlier, but of all the chapters, especially in the first unit, this is probably one of my favorite chapters, just because of a lot of the information that's covered and so on. And so we're starting off here talking about food preservation and processing. So I want to stop a little bit because generally when we hear the term processing, we think of something negative right off the bat. And I want to change that because once again, processing just means how that food has been handled. And some of that is done to preserve food, to extend shelf life, to make different things available for a wide variety of the year, to add nutrients that might not be there naturally, if we're talking about fortified foods and things like that. So I think it's really important to really understand this term processing, okay? And many of them are old methods designed to preserve food. If we look at some old methods that have been around for a really long time, fermenting, sugaring, salting, smoking, drying. Those are all examples of how people used to preserve foods prior to refrigeration and other more recent measures that we now know. If we look at things that are probably a little bit newer, pasteurization, sterilization, canning, aseptic processing, refrigeration, freezing, packing in nitrogen, food irradiation, and the use of food additives. So once again, I want us to get away from the fact that when we hear the term processing, it's not always negative, okay? Now, sometimes we will see some negative things associated with it. If you have someone that's eating lots of processed foods, generally you're going to have a higher than necessary sodium intake and things like that. But I want us to get away from the fact that processing is bad. Preservation is really important for our safety of food. Now, probably one thing that scares a lot of people is the concept of food irradiation. And what's happening here is radiation is used to actually control the growth of insects and pathogens, and it extends the shelf life of food. Now, it's important to realize irradiated food is not radioactive. It's like a beam similar to a microwave that passes through food, and this has been approved for safety reasons through the FDA. But foods that are irradiated must actually labeled with this particular label. Now, I like hamburgers, okay? And I like my hamburgers medium rare or close to rare. And there's a lot of places where they won't serve it that way. So Wegmans actually has beef that's been irradiated, and literally you could just eat it raw without cooking and it would be perfectly safe. Not that I'm going to do that, but that's one of the safety things that you see with food irradiation. It basically eliminates bacteria and makes it much safer overall and eliminates most pathogens. Now, other things that we're going to find in processed foods are additives. And additives serve a lot of different purposes. Some of the most common reasons why we see additives are to keep foods nutritious, fresh, safe, and appealing. You want your food to look nice, okay? So that something is one of the things. Quite often you'll see an antioxidant that's there to prevent the browning, okay, of a particular food and so on. Now, there's two different types of additives. We want to talk about those that are considered to be intentional versus those that are incidental. Okay. Now, intentional food additives, they've been there on purpose, and there's a goal for them to be there. So if we look at some common reasons why we see intentional food additives, not uncommon to have a longer shelf life, increase nutritional value, or actually make colors or flavors more appealing. Okay. Now, incidental food additives, they kind of got in the food through some processing, cultivation, packaging, transport, or storage, and they're not put there intentionally. And some examples are pesticides, arsenic. If we look at BPA, that's something that you've probably heard of before. And plastics, okay? And BPA is actually an endocrine disruptor, and it alters normal metabolic mechanisms, and it's been associated with a number of disorders such as liver and pancreatic damage, an increased risk of obesity, cardiovascular disease, and diabetes, and thyroid dysfunction. One thing that you probably see all the time when you buy a water bottle, right? BPA free. Okay, and so that's a really good example, where we know something that's not intentional or incidental, and really trying to get away from it. And water bottles and lots of plastics are a really good example that we're trying to stay away from this BPA. Now, this is a list of common food additives, and what I want to kind of take a look at, what are some reasons? Okay, so if we look at antimicrobial agents, that kind of makes sense. If we look at sodium benzoate, you've probably seen that before, and what that does, it basically inhibits growth of molds, fungi, and bacteria in beverages, baked goods, jams, and things like that. That sounds pretty good. If we look at antioxidants, so this is going to prevent the things that occur with oxidation for the most part. If we look at curing agents, so especially things as far as beefs, okay, beef, deli meats, things like that are cured. Various types of salamis are really good examples. So those are all examples of real common food additives. If you think about altered sweeteners such as aspartame, okay, if we look at things that are flavorful, so salt is an additive, sugar, herbs, spices, flavors, we don't often think of that as something considered to be an additive. Color enhancers, all those different things. So very commonly used, and for the most part, very safe because they've been tested for that. So something to kind of keep in mind overall. Now, when we look at synthetic versus natural, and there are a lot of plant toxins out there that are actually worse and more dangerous than additives that are intentionally added to food. So that's important to keep in mind. Just because it's natural doesn't necessarily mean it's safe. So when we look at some of these, the toxicity is going to depend on the effect it has in the body, okay? Not whether it's synthesized in a laboratory or not. Now, dosage is also important. If we look at table salt, okay, so table salt safe within reason, but can cause illness or death if ingested in really large amounts. So we kind of have to think about synthetic versus natural. Synthetic is not always a bad thing. So I think that's something we kind of have to keep in mind also. Now, if we're looking at the regulation and safety of food additives, this is under the auspice of the FDA. And so they require manufacturers to test and prove safety of new additives. Now, there's some that are actually exempt. So these were additives that were designated prior to 1954, recognized as safe. And then there's this terminology that I want you to be comfortable with, GRAs. And what that means are those things that are generally recognized as safe. So if you see that, that's what that means. Now, one thing that has happened, because once again, there's a demand for natural foods. And many food producers now are trying to produce foods that don't have as many additives because that's the direction consumers are going in. They want natural foods. A really good example, if I look at the natural foods area in Wegmans, I will call it Sticks and Twigs. And when I first got here, I've been in Rochester now for about this is my 21st year at MCC, and that natural food section at Wegmans was maybe 1 to 2 aisles. Think about how big it's grown, especially in those bigger Wegmans, so the mothership store at Pittsford and those types of areas. So very, very large natural food sections. That's what people want. There's the demand for that. And so once again, food producers have kind of cooperated and are trying to meet that particular demand because consumers want it. Now, here would be some examples of additives. So here we have a cola, so chances are we got a couple of different additives here, such as coloring and things like that. Now, the can here, the inner lining, this is one of those areas where BPA is known to be found. So there we have an example on the left of an intentional food additive, and on the right, a can with an inner lining that probably has BPA in it.